Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.55 and this is our amplitude / dynamics effects wrap-up video, but specifically a lot of these bullet points are directed at compression. So do keep that in mind as I go through these bullets. The majority of these are dealing with compression, but I thought it would be a good idea to make this video because there's so much out there on compression and there's a lot of really kind of crazy myths out there, and then there's some misleading information too. So hopefully in this video, I'll try to clear up the way I see it and in maybe some ways that could potentially help you down the road. So a few things to remember or consider. Avoid presets, or at the very least, be sure that when you are using presets that you need to really dial in that threshold setting to work for your signal, to work for your sound. Because when those people were dialing in their preset settings, they had no idea what you're planning to use. So it doesn't really work like it does with some of the other effects like chorus, flanging, phasing. You can dial in a preset and yeah, you're going to probably tweak it to taste, but you could use that on pretty much any signal and it's going to have a similar effect to what they dialed in when they were making that preset. With compression, it doesn't work like that because every signal has a unique amplitude envelope, and therefore you need to make sure that you tailor the compressor to fit that amplitude envelope. So be sure to get that threshold setting so you can see it bouncing, or you can at least see that there's moments of compression and non-compression, and then try to dial in those attack and release settings based on what you're going for. With compression especially, and with limiting and stuff, I like to really dial up extreme settings first so I get it to sound horrible at the beginning, and then I start to pull things back to get it to where I like. And that way, if I, for example, you saw me put the release all the way up and then slowly but surely start to clock it back, I never went too far, the other direction, which I think is really helpful for a lot of people, as compared to putting the release dead in the middle and then trying out maybe what happens if I pull it back, what happens if I increase it. I personally find that doing it the way by pushing everything to super far extremes and then trying to work yourself back to what you want, that's always tended to work best for me, but feel free to go about it however you want. Again, this one's pretty specific to compressors, but also to the gate, and when you think about the side chaining function as well, there's the creative use versus the, what I would like to call the fix it in the mix usage of some of these dynamic processors. When you're in a position where you're trying to make things fit, you're trying to glue everything together in your track, you're going to use the compressor and even the limiter in a way as to try to make everything fit and to mold and to gel together. That's very different from putting on a compressor and just going crazy to get a totally new and unique sound. This is also true with like the transient controller too. There are uses for the transient controller when you just need to get that little bit extra bit of kick at the start, that little extra transient punch, in which case I'd say you're using it in more of a fixing it in the mix type situation. Compare that to taking the transient controller and dropping the attack all the way down and boosting up the sustain. At that point, you're doing something totally creative and you're really shaping the sound and not so much focused on just trying to get everything to fit together so well. We also talked about the unique character of all of these devices and all of these plugins. And even when I was using the peak limiter, I figured it was going to sound really bad, but turned out it sounded pretty good. So always have an open mind and do everything you possibly can to experiment in as many situations you could possibly imagine. For example, when I'm talking about experimenting with, let's say, a compressor, or even something like the rotary or the tremolo, think about using multiple instances with different settings, see what sort of result that gives you, and don't be afraid that you can put on multiple compressors, for example, in a chain to really try to control the sound. So if you want a compressor to deal with the transient hits at the start, the attack of the sound, that's great. And then if you want to use something to more level out the whole thing, you could throw the compressor into RMS mode and do it that way. We'll talk more about this in a couple of videos, but also just so you're aware, you can work in parallel, as in you could have, let's say, a vocal, and it's just the raw vocal, and you want to keep that in the mix, but you could duplicate the track, and then you could actually add a compressor to that duplicate and really compress the heck out of it, add in a little bit of that channel, but then still maintain the original. That's something we'll be looking at in much greater detail as we move forward. And also, we have multi-band spectral processing too, where we'll split the frequency band and then apply something like compression to each of those bands individually. It's more of an advanced topic, but now that we actually understand what a compressor is actually doing and its real use, we should be able to understand spectral processing a little bit better. It shouldn't be so scary. I know when people open up multi-band compressors, they look at it like they've never seen something like that before, but really all it is multiple compressors dedicated to a specific range in your frequency spectrum. So we'll be looking at that, and hopefully I can give you guys some tips and not make it quite as scary as it seems. So a common question that I come across and that people seem to ask is, why is compression so hard? It seems like online the professionals claim that the compressor is what saves all of their mixes, that's what gives them that edge over everybody else. And really that's not true. In my opinion, the reason why compression appears to be so hard is because there is no analogous process to compression or limiting in any other creative art form. Oftentimes we end up using the compressor at the very end of our chain or in the mixing/mastering process. Why do we do that? Well, because we want to do everything we possibly can to shape our sound, and then if we feel like the dynamic range is out of control, we'll put a compressor on at the end. You could put a compressor at the beginning, you could put a compressor in the middle, but oftentimes we only really find a use for the compressor at the end of our chain. Now, that's a little bit different. So it's not like a painter, for example, will take his final canvas and go give it to a guy who's a mixing engineer or mastering engineer to try to add extra sheen, depth, or contrast to the work. The work is the work. That's all the painter. You can't take it to somebody else and say, hey, you're the master on depth. Try to give this painting some more of that. It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's what makes compression so confusing, because you look at it and you go, well, what is this like in any other art form? And I really can't think of anything else to compare it to. And that's what's always given me trouble with compression. To me, that's what makes understanding compression so difficult. Plus, our ears and brains have developed to a point where even if we compress a whisper and a scream to be that same level, at least visually, we will still perceive the scream as being louder, right? So some of that has to do with frequency content. Some of that just has to do with emphasis, with timbre, the fact that we can hear emotion in a voice. You know, all of those things are very difficult to explain away by just saying, okay, if we put a compressor on here and we level these out, they're going to have the exact same perceived loudness. That's obviously not true. So final thoughts here. Always remember that there is kind of two hats you have to wear when you're creating music. There's the artist and then there's the engineer, or what I like to call the geek in the studio, and then more of the artist in the studio. Now, I personally am a geek. I admit it. I love looking at the history of old studio gear, but you have to really try your best not to get too caught up in it. I personally know I will never own a vintage piece of gear. I can't pay, the ridiculous amounts of money that these things go for. And I also know that it's not essential to making good music. Don't let, those in the industry attempt to tell you otherwise. They're really looking out for themselves, and they're just trying to impress a lot of clients. A lot of people will go to a mixing engineer if they know, oh my gosh, this guy has 4 Pultec EQs. He's got, this SSL console that all of my favorite records have been made on. He's got some API compressors, all of that stuff. And that will trick a lot of people. And the mixing engineers will say, hey, look, nobody else can achieve the sound that I can give you. But oh, so often they just end up using plugins anyway. So don't feel like you need to own this stuff to make good music. People will try to tell you otherwise, and then you fall into that crazy trap, like I explained in video 100, where it's like you always need to have that other thing before you can make good music. Totally not true. You can make great music without a compressor, or you can make great music with a compressor. So I always try to convince people of this, and this is where this might surprise you a little bit if you know and have watched a lot of my videos. Ignore all the subjectivity on the subject of compression, of limiting, etc. Again, these things like the loudness war, and now a lot of engineers coming out and saying, look, don't compress things so hard, etc. You just need to ignore all that crap, because what that does is it sells magazines, it generates traffic on sites, on websites, I'm saying, and that's what they're going for. They're just looking for publicity. People like to talk about the subject. Honestly, just ignore it. Focus on making your music. And if you are a mixing or mastering engineer, focus on getting the sound your client wants. If your client wants something that's super overly compressed, do it. If they don't. I feel like there's no reason for us to write books and have all these crazy long panel discussions and debates on these topics. It's really just silly. It's just another way for those in the industry to maintain their hold and to maintain their power. My best advice to everybody all the time is just do whatever you want. If you want to compress everything like crazy, go ahead and do it. If you want to use zero dynamic processors, do it. Many misuses of something like the compressor have become aesthetic staples to certain genres of music. You can hear that pumping sound of the compressor on a lot of dance music, that really overly sidechained, compressed elements to songs, and that's what gives it some of its character. And so if you're looking for that kind of result, do it. You at the end of the day are an individual. And with working inside of the digital audio workstation, when you're working with sounds and with music, it's one of the few times when you're really 100% free to just do whatever you want. It's your art. You are the artist. You are the individual. Do whatever feels right to you, not what some guy in a $3 million studio is saying. I don't know how that's ever going to help any of you guys, because those people, they're coming at it from their perspective. Obviously, I'm coming at it from my perspective. And what I want is for all of you to approach these topics from your perspective. The one thing I would add, the one kind of caveat to that, is compression is very difficult, and it just takes a lot of time to really hear those differences. So if you ever just feel like you don't know what you're doing with a processor, just don't use it until you get better, until you have the time to sit down and really experiment and really think about what it is you're doing when you're turning a certain knob and applying a certain effect. So here's the overall conclusion. You'll hear a lot of mixing and mastering engineers talk about how the steady decrease in dynamic range is ruining music. But for me, if that's so true, why do those same people continue to process sound the way they do? If they were so passionate about sound, they wouldn't, regardless of the label pressure and other external circumstances. As somebody who's fairly cynical, I often wonder if they continue to go on and on about this to try and persuade their competition not to limit or compress in such a fashion. So you'll hear some of the big guys, some of the big names in the industry constantly whining and complaining about there's no more dynamic range, there's no this, there's no that. And I just, want to tell those guys to shut up, because they're the same exact people who are part of the problem. They're the ones who will do those things because they want the dollar. They complain about it all they want, but if it means possibly not getting that extra $20, they'll be the first ones to strap it on there and do it. So to me, you have to make sure you approach it the same way. Don't let people talk you out of doing something just because you think that they're, the knowledgeable person. They may be the knowledgeable person, but they're also looking out for their best interests. So do be careful of that and just do whatever sounds right to you. Also, if you've ever listened to music in the car, and it's really noisy and loud, obviously that music needs to be super compressed or people aren't going to be able to hear any of the stuff going on. And then, that just doesn't work. Not everybody has a super hi-fi system. The majority of people are listening inside of iPod headphones. And if you know that that's your audience, you do need to cater to your audience. And I'll repeat what I always repeat in pretty much all of these videos. Interesting music is interesting music, period. And I could care less how you process your sounds, because you as the artist and the creative individual, you're the one that really matters in the grand scheme of things. So I know this might sound a little bit different to some things I've said before, and I do have my own opinions on these subject matters, but personally I don't think you should be subjected to having to hear my own opinion when you can form one yourself. Again, a lot of people don't like the overly compressed sound, and then a lot of people do. And I'm not going to tell you how you should be processing your music. What I will tell you is you need to experiment, and you need to practice, and you need to really sit there and listen to what is happening to your sounds before making those final decisions. All right, thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.